As you might know, kids like to play this game where they'll ask each other, if you could have one superpower, what would it be? And then they'll all go through and name the one. I want super speed, or I want super strength, or I want to be able to fly. And of course, naturally, as a young boy, I ended up playing this game a few times with my friends. And I would always say the same thing, and people always thought I was really dumb for saying it. I would say, I want super persuasion. Because if I have the ability to convince somebody that something is true, then I don't need super strength or the ability to fly or super speed, because I can persuade the people with those powers to do whatever I want. And I still think today that that's the best superpower to have. I just understand that now as rhetoric, the art of persuasion. So that when I was a young man in a recent convert to Catholicism, I was eager to share my faith with others, as I obviously still am today. I had benefited so much from that transaction that I desperately wanted the same thing for other people that I cared about. And I knew that if I was going to be persuasive, I'd have to be congenial. I'd have to be patient and even tolerant of the views of other people in those exchanges. I didn't have to be told that to speak truth, you also needed to be mindful of charity. I took examples of people like C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton as my abiding inspiration. Chesterton, who wrote a whole book called Heretics about people and views that he disagreed with in his day, but spent a good portion of each chapter lauding the merits of the people whose ideas he opposed. I took encyclicals like Pope Benedict's Caritas and Veritate to heart, in which he teaches us that to be a true Christian witness, we have to balance the concerns of both charity and truth, and that if either becomes disproportioned, the message of the gospel will suffer. Sadly, in a short period of time since that encyclical was written, we seem to have forgotten at least the veritate part of that equation. And then as I graduated from reading Lewis and Chesterton and started to read the sources that gave them such a depth of wisdom, I have to admit, I was a bit surprised, maybe even shocked by what I found. It was something of what they say is a red pill moment, right? Because I was a firm believer that the church was essentially the same today as it was 100, 500, even 1,000 years ago. Of course, some things change along the way, but the defining substance of the church would have had to have remained consistent. And surely whatever we mean by charity when we speak of truth and charity in our approach to interacting with outsiders and evangelization, surely that would have to be one of those things that would remain consistent, right? After all, this is the preeminent theological virtue. It can't be subject to winds of doctrine. But the more I read the great saints and doctors of the church, the more I realized that there was a fairly uniform consistency to this approach, but with the exception that lies in the age that I'm living in right now. I came to realize that what we mean by speaking the truth with charity today actually just means truth with affability, non-assertiveness, or cordiality. It means acting like we're all friends with disagreements that are secondary to our earnest desire for peace and friendship. It means tolerance and even respect for views that are contrary to the teachings of the church, even blasphemous views, keeping in mind that St. Thomas taught blasphemy was worse than murder. But charity does not mean amiability. It means willing the good of another person. An authentic, supernatural love, the kind that God has for us, isn't about affirming people in their current state of mind or their behavior. It can often be like a sour medicine that confronts us and shakes us loose of our lazy assumptions and our disregard for our poor moral conduct. It can at times look like a harsh correction or even rebuke. But whenever a prominent voice in the church does this today, they are almost universally denounced as lacking in charity. I recently saw a thread on a social media site that will remain unnamed, but it was of Catholics who were describing YouTubers that they don't like, with yours truly making the grade once or twice, I'm proud to say. But another personality that featured quite a bit was Taylor Marshall, and the reason given over and over again was his lack of charity. And now, I don't agree with Taylor Marshall on everything, but is it fair to accuse him of lacking charity because he isn't agreeable? The more I've read the great fathers and doctors in the church, the more I've come to realize that being disagreeable is actually entirely consistent with their example. And that isn't the exception. I'm going to share some examples with you, but you don't have to look far for this. Read any text by a church father against some heresy or someone they disagree with, and then ask yourself if you could imagine anyone today, especially in the episcopacy or in the clergy, addressing an ideological opponent like that. So St. Cyril of Alexandria was one of my first exposures to this kind of rhetoric, as he had this extended and very public conflict with the notorious heretic Nestorius, specifically about the incarnation and the unity of Christ. Cyril said this about Nestorius, quote, "Who is this serpent who has so recently appeared? And what are these idiotic things he sets against the teachings of truth? He is that crooked one who is drunk on his own venom." And we could read something like that and say, oh, well, not everything a saint does or says is an example of why they became a saint or a doctor. But this is perhaps Cyril's most famous work on the unity of Christ. He takes this tone because Nestorius' ideas were threatening the very integrity of the church and risked leading countless souls astray. If anything is worth fighting over, surely it's that. But we refuse to fight today. We live in an age of relentless confusion, and I would argue it's because of this lack of fortitude to say what must be said, as unpleasant as it could be at times. You would never hear a churchman speak like that today, and yet the need for it seems like it has never been greater. How about Saint Jerome, the same Saint Jerome who translated the Bible into the Latin Vulgate? I'm tempted, I'm smiling because so many of the things that he said are just kind of running through my mind right now. And I mean, the guy was savage at times. One example that comes to mind was that he wrote in defense of the perpetual virginity of Mary against Helvidius. And in the very first paragraph, he says that he had been asked by several of the brethren to write this response to Helvidius, but that he, quote, deferred doing so, not because it is a difficult matter to maintain the truth and refute an ignorant boor who has scarce known the first glimmer of learning, but because I was afraid my reply might make him appear worth defeating. Ouch. He goes on to accuse him of being a slanderer, a blasphemer, and describes his teaching as disgusting ravings. He takes a similar tone against Jovinianus, describing him as a glutton more concerned with the kitchen than with the teachings of Christ. St. Nicholas, yes, that same jolly old St. Nick, is famous for having supposedly slapped Arius at the Council of Nicaea. And even if that's apocryphal, as some people claim, there's probably a reason that story exists. There was probably a confrontation which was less than congenial. When St. Polycarp, who was the disciple of St. John the Apostle, met Marcion in Rome, Marcion asked him if he knew who he was, to which Polycarp replied, "Yes, you are the firstborn of Satan." That's a phrase that I've seen Sam Shamoun, which I think is his last name, who is a pretty well-known YouTuber and apologist, who takes a pretty abrasive approach to especially Muslims that he interacts with on his live streams. And I have to admit, the first time I saw him talk to people that way, I was a little taken aback, and my first instinct was to say, boy, that's not very charitable. But, again, the more I think about how this approach to rhetoric has been employed throughout the history of the church, the more I realize, who am I to say that that's not charitable? How about St. John Chrysostom speaking against the Judaizers? He said this in a homily I can't even give the title to because my video would probably get taken down if I did. He said, quote, "Where a harlot has set herself up, that place is a brothel. But the synagogue is not only a brothel and a theater, it also is a den of robbers and a lodging for wild beasts." Wow. St. Catherine of Siena wrote this to cardinals who claimed that Urban VI was the valid pontiff against Clement VII. She said, "Ah, foolish men worthy of 1,000 deaths! As blind, you do not see your own wrong, and have fallen into such confusion that you make your own selves liars and idolaters." And that's just a small sample of the denunciations she composed for corrupt clergy in her day. Similarly, St. Peter Damian wrote his Liber Gomorianus to denounce the rampant clerical corruption of his day. He attacked simoniacal, I think that's how you say it, clergy, saying that the masses and prayers of this kind of priest and cleric bring upon the people the wrath of God. Speaking of the sin of Sodom, which was conspicuous again among the clergy in his day, he says this, "Truly this vice is never to be compared with any other vice because it surpasses the enormity of all vices. It defiles everything, stains everything, pollutes everything. And as for itself, it permits nothing pure, nothing clean, nothing other than filth." Imagine what St. Peter's reply might be to someone like Father James Martin or Cardinal McElroy, who speaks so softly and warmly of this particular inclination. And then into the modern age, you can read encyclicals by people like Pius IX, who condemned liberalism and modernism as monstrous errors, or Pius X, who called modernists the worst enemies of the church. Pius XI, in his encyclical Mitbrenniger Sorge, wrote this about Nazism long before the war and long before the rest of the world woke up to its evil. He said, quote, "None but the simple-minded could stumble into conceptions of a national God or a national religion, or attempt to lock within the frontiers of a single people, within the narrow limits of a single race." And then suddenly in the mid-20th century, this kind of rhetoric just disappears. The example, I would say, probably being set by Vatican II in the opening address by Pope St. John XXIII, who said that this council would avoid condemnation and anathema, instead employing the, quote, medicine of mercy, optimistically charting a course of dialogue between the church and the modern world as friends and neighbors. And if you find that relentless approach frustrating, as I sometimes do, you have to remember that this was a generation that had just experienced the carnage, the horror of 2 world wars, Hitlerism, genocide, and not just the threat, but the actual use of atomic bombs in war. This was a traumatized generation who had seen the absolute extremes of conflict and were probably recoiling so far in the other direction that it's probably fair to say that they were overcompensating just a bit. The whole peace and love hippie movement of that era was this exact kind of reaction. They say that trauma can produce effects like age regression, where adults revert to the behaviors and the coping emotional mechanisms of children under certain conditions. And that's what that looks like in retrospect. It's the simple naivety of children, but perversely sustained by adults who can't afford to be so childish and effeminate. The Council Fathers were a severely traumatized generation, which is why they were so receptive to a new direction, not just for the church, but for the whole world. One that seeks peace and fraternity rather than conflict. One that avoids denunciation and abrasiveness out of fear that such conflict could escalate to the pitch that it did during those war years. But the thing is, the enemies of the church, of which there are many, they did not respond in kind. They did not take their foot off the gas pedal. The church has been playing a game of diplomacy and dialogue with the world, while the world has been playing a game of espionage. They never stopped writing books, producing movies, and promoting activism that ridicules and denounces the Catholic Church. Think about how Catholic priests or nuns appear in Hollywood movies since 1960, and then ask yourself what the ratio of flattering versus unflattering depictions are. Just this past week, the Oscars had nominated 2 blatantly anti-Catholic films, Conclave and Sugarcane. Sugarcane is a documentary about Canadian residential schools, which makes the easily debunked claim that children were being incinerated in ovens to hide crimes of sexual abuse by Catholic clergy. The documentary takes such an insanely absurd position. It repeatedly contradicts itself with its own information and tries to maintain a narrative so outlandish that the only reason people would believe it is because it denounces the Catholic Church as genocidal, which people are apparently all too desperate to believe. And I might be wrong about this, but to my knowledge, not a single bishop has spoken out against that blood libel. Any other recognizable minority would have sued them for defamation, but we are so committed to upholding this distorted standard of charity that we will abide and sometimes even endorse outright falsehoods against us, as many Canadian bishops have. And whenever a lay Catholic like myself takes a tone that is a bit more contrarian or combative or intolerant to the excessive evils of our age, a tone that was emblematic through the entire history of the church all the way up until the past few decades, we get accused of forgetting charity. This is an approach, a tone, a style of rhetoric, whatever you want to call it, that was ubiquitous among the saints and doctors of the church for centuries. Who are we to say that they lacked charity, unless we want to believe that the charity is subject to currents of fashion? Far from being the very nature of God himself, it's actually just whatever we happen to define it as at a certain point in history. But nowhere in the church's theology was the supernatural virtue of charity ever defined as mere congeniality. After all, the devil himself can be congenial when he wants to, when it serves his purposes. But the devil is wholly incapable of exercising the theological virtue of charity. Okay, thanks for watching. These videos and this channel are only possible because of viewer support. So if you can spare some help, please consider making a contribution through my website at brianholdsworth.ca, or join my locals community at brianholdsworth.locals.com, where you can interact with myself and other like-minded individuals. We actually just started a monthly Zoom meetup where we're studying some articles of St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa. So if that's interesting to you, then come join us there. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe.